A woman may survive poverty, scandal, and silence, but nothing cuts deeper than being pitted in a room full of people trained to smile while they watch you bleed. Clara Whitmore stood beneath the silver chandeliers of Alderwick Assembly House with her gloved hand resting lightly on the shoulder of her father's wheelchair, feeling every whisper in the room settle over her like falling ash. The great hall had been polished until it shone, all marble floors, crystal glasses, ivory gowns, and black evening coats, yet no amount of candlelight could soften the cruelty hidden behind painted fans and courteous bows. Around her, daughters of noble houses moved like swans across a lake, each one presented with laughter, music, and the quiet promise of advantageous marriage. Clara had not been presented. She had been examined. There was a difference, and everyone in the room knew it. Her gown was pale blue, carefully mended at the cuffs, modest but clean, with a ribbon at the throat that had belonged to her late mother. Beside her, Earl Henry Whitmore sat with his spine held as straight as his failing body allowed, his white-gloved hands folded over a wool blanket laid across his knees. Once men had crossed rooms to seek his opinion. Once his name had opened doors. Now those same doors seemed to close softly whenever his chair approached. Poor thing! Someone murmured near the refreshment table. Such a burden at her age! Another voice answered, sweeter and sharper. No one will marry the crippled Earl's daughter. The words did not strike loudly. They did not need to. They traveled through the hall with the elegance of poison. Clara felt her father's fingers tighten, just once, against the blanket. She placed her hand over his before he could speak, not to silence him, but to save him from the humiliation of defending her in a room that had already decided neither of them was worth hearing. She lifted her chin. Her gray eyes did not search for sympathy. Sympathy had always been the cheapest coin of society, offered freely by those who would never pay in kindness. Across the room, Lord Preston Vale watched her with the bright amusement of a man who had never been denied anything that mattered. His mother, Lady Beatrice Vale, leaned toward him with a whisper and a smile. A moment later, Preston stepped forward, his polished shoes striking the marble in time with the dying notes of the orchestra. Miss Whitmore, he said, bowing with theatrical grace, would you do me the honor of standing where everyone may see you more clearly? A few guests laughed behind their fans. Clara knew the trap. She also knew that refusing would be called bitterness, and obeying would be called desperation. So she moved one step forward, leaving her hand on her father's chair until the final second. Preston's smile widened. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, turning slightly toward the room, we are told that marriage is an act of alliance, fortune, and good sense. Yet here stands a lady with no dowry to speak of, no political weight, and a household so diminished that even charity must pause before crossing its threshold. The music stopped completely. Somewhere, a glass touched a tray with a delicate sound that seemed too fragile for such a moment. Clara heard her father inhale, ragged and wounded. Preston continued, his voice soft enough to seem polite and loud enough to be merciless. A ruined house. A broken father. And a daughter with nothing but quiet eyes. What man would purchase such sorrow? The hall went still, not from shock, but from appetite. They wanted her tears. They wanted trembling hands, a lowered head, the collapse that would prove their judgment right. Clara gave them none of it. She turned only enough to rest her hand again upon her father's shoulder. He looked up at her with grief deeper than shame, and she smiled faintly, the way one lights a candle in a room where winter has entered. Forgive me, Papa, she whispered. For what, my child? His voice barely carried. For making you sit through this. Before he could answer, a new voice came from the far end of the hall, low, calm, and colder than the wind moving over the cliffs of North Alderwick. Then it is fortunate she was never meant for a man of your size. Every head turned. Beneath the archway stood Elias Montgomery, Duke of Westhaven, dressed in black, his broad shoulders silvered by candlelight, his face unreadable beneath dark hair touched by the faintest trace of winter at the temples. He had entered without announcement, or perhaps the room had simply been too busy feeding on humiliation to notice power when it crossed the threshold. Preston's color changed. Lady Beatrice's fan stopped midair. Clara had seen portraits of the Duke, heard his name spoken with caution in drawing rooms and court corridors, but no painting had captured the stillness of him, the kind that made noise feel vulgar. He walked toward her through the parted crowd, each step measured, each silence bending around him. When he reached Clara, he did not look first at Preston, nor at the watching nobles, nor at the faded ribbon on her gown. He looked at her face, as if her composure were not an absence of feeling, but a form of courage. Then the most powerful duke in the kingdom bowed before the woman no one would marry. The bow lasted only a moment, yet it changed the temperature of the room. Clara felt it before she understood it, a sudden withdrawal of laughter, a tightening of breath, the invisible machinery of society halting because it had been forced to witness something it could not explain. Elias Montgomery straightened with the composure of a man who had never needed permission to alter the course of an evening. His dark eyes remained on Clara, not pitying, not amused, not searching for weakness. Behind her, Earl Henry Whitmore sat very still, one hand pressed against the arm of his chair as though the past itself had reached across the polished floor to steady him. "Your Grace?" Preston Vale managed, his voice thinner than before. "Surely you do not mean to involve yourself in a harmless social exchange?" Elias turned his head at last. "Harmless things do not leave wounds, Lord Vale. They merely leave no witnesses brave enough to name them." A murmur moved through the assembly. Preston opened his mouth, but his mother caught his sleeve with fingers stiff as ivory. Even Lady Beatrice understood what her son did not. A duke could be insulted only by someone equal enough to survive the consequence, and no man in that hall stood equal to Westhaven. Clara should have felt rescued. Instead, she felt exposed in a different way, as if the Duke had drawn back a curtain she had spent years holding closed. There had been humiliation before tonight, of course. It had lived in smaller rooms. It had worn gentler voices. It had arrived in letters declining invitations, in merchants demanding payment before delivery, in neighbors who remembered her father only when they wished to speak of what he had lost. Whitmore Grange had once stood bright on the hills of North Alderwick, its white stone walls catching the morning sun, its lawns sweeping toward the sea grass and the silver road beyond. Clara remembered music in the east parlor, roses climbing the conservatory glass, her father riding home at dusk with laughter in his voice and rain on his coat. That was before the hunting accident. Before the horse came back riderless. Before the doctors spoke in careful tones and the servants wept in corners. Before the Earl of Whitmore woke to find that his legs would no longer obey him and half the county decided that a man seated in a chair had somehow become less than a man. The year after that had been measured in departures. The head groom left first, then 2 maids, then the cook who said she could not remain in a house where every pantry shelf looked like a confession. Clara learned accounts by candlelight. She learned which creditors could be softened by honesty and which ones required silence. She sold her mother's emerald combs, then the silver tea service, then 3 hunting prints from the West Corridor. She kept the books balanced by inches, preserved the tenants' wages, and wrote every letter her father could no longer bear to send. Still, the world did not call her capable. It called her unfortunate. It did not call him loyal. It called him crippled. Yet the accident had never settled cleanly in Clara's mind. There had been no storm that day, no broken bridge, no startled fox crossing the path as the men claimed. Only one detail had remained sharp through every retelling. Her father had returned from the capital with a sealed letter hidden in his coat, and by dawn, both the letter and his strength were gone. Now, standing beneath the chandeliers while Duke Elias Montgomery watched her as though he could see not only the insult but every year that had led to it, Clara felt the old question stir again like a candle waking in a sealed room. "Miss Whitmore," Elias said, his voice lower now, meant for her yet heard by all. "May I escort you and your father to a quieter place?" It was not an order. That made it more dangerous. It offered her dignity in a room that had tried to strip it from her. Clara looked at her father. Earl Henry's eyes glistened, but his chin rose with the last remains of an old pride. "We would be honored, Your Grace," he said. As Elias stepped behind the wheelchair and guided it himself through the divided crowd, Clara walked beside them, her gown whispering over the marble. No one laughed now. No one pitted aloud. And for the first time that evening, the silence belonged not to cruelty, but to fear. The retiring room beyond the east gallery was small enough to feel almost private, though the voices of the assembly still drifted through the walls like distant rain. A fire burned beneath a carved mantel, its warmth touching Clara's chilled fingers as Elias positioned Earl Henry's chair near the hearth with careful respect. He did not ask a servant to do it. He did not perform the kindness for display. That unsettled Clara more than the whispers had. Men who wished to impress the room always looked back to see who was watching. Elias Montgomery never looked back. "Thank you, Your Grace," Earl Henry said, his voice dignified despite the tremor beneath it. "My daughter and I have endured worse than foolish words, but I will not pretend they were easy to hear." Elias stood with one hand resting lightly on the back of a velvet chair. In the firelight, his features appeared sterner, carved by grief rather than vanity. Foolish words reveal careful intentions when spoken by men who believe themselves safe. Clara studied him then, truly studied him, and saw that his arrival had not been accidental. The Duke of Westhaven did not wander into provincial assemblies for entertainment. He belonged to darker rooms, council chambers, banks, military offices, and corridors where powerful men lowered their voices when he passed. She had heard that the king himself trusted Elias more than his ministers. She had heard that Westhaven ships controlled the northern sea routes, that Westhaven farms fed half the capital during the hard winter 8 years before, that Westhaven money could raise a family or quietly bury one. Yet here he was in a modest retiring room in Alderwick, speaking to a ruined earl and his daughter, as though their disgrace had weight in the affairs of a kingdom. "You came for my father," Clara said softly. Elias turned to her. The fire snapped once, bright and sudden. "Yes." Earl Henry's hand tightened on the blanket. "Then the letter reached you?" The question entered the room like a ghost. Elias's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "No. Only the warning that a letter had been sent. By the time my men searched the route between the capital and North Alderwick, there was nothing left to find." Clara felt the floor seem to draw away beneath her. For years, the missing letter had lived in her mind as a private suspicion, a grief-shaped mystery no one else cared to touch. Now it stood between them, acknowledged and breathing. Earl Henry closed his eyes. "I should have sent a writer I trusted. I was too confident in old loyalties. You were betrayed by men who depended on your honor making you predictable," Elias said. There was no softness in the words, but there was understanding. Clara watched him as the fire painted gold along the edge of his black coat. The world called him cold, but she began to wonder whether coldness was merely the shape grief took when it had no safe place to go. "Why did you not come sooner?" she asked. It was a bold question, perhaps an improper one, yet the evening had already stripped politeness of its usefulness. Elias accepted it without offense. "Because I did not know whether your father lived with knowledge or with danger. I could not bring attention to Whitmore Grange until I knew which enemy still watched it." Earl Henry opened his eyes, old pain moving across his face. "And now?" Elias looked toward the closed door, beyond which the assembly resumed in strained fragments, its music uncertain, its laughter weakened. "Now Lord Prestonvale has made the mistake of speaking too loudly." Clara's pulse changed. "The valets?" "Among others," Elias said. "Your father uncovered a circle of noble families using war debts to purchase influence over the crown. Quietly. Respectably. With signatures instead of swords." He paused, as though choosing how much truth the room could bear. "My late betrothed died while carrying proof of a similar scheme to Westhaven." The confession fell without drama, which made it heavier. Clara saw then the locked places inside him, the reason his name carried power but not warmth. He had not merely lost a woman. He had lost trust in the world that had smiled over her absence. Earl Henry bowed his head. "I am sorry." Elias gave a small nod, accepting sorrow without inviting comfort. Clara looked down at her hands. The same society that had laughed at her poverty had been built, perhaps, by men profiting from ruin. Her humiliation was no longer a single cruel evening. It was connected to something larger, older, and far more dangerous. "Then what do you want from us?" she asked. Elias met her eyes. "The truth. And your permission to stand close enough that those who threatened your house must reveal themselves." Before Clara could answer, the door opened without a knock. Preston Vale stood there, smiling too brightly, his mother behind him like a shadow dressed in pearls. His gaze moved from the Earl to Clara, then to Elias. "Forgive the intrusion," Preston said. "We were concerned Miss Whitmore might have mistaken public embarrassment for private encouragement." Elias did not move. He did not raise his voice. "Enter carefully, Lord Vale. You are very near the edge of your future." Preston Vale stepped into the retiring room with the confidence of a man who mistook inheritance for courage. But the moment Elias Montgomery turned fully toward him, that confidence thinned at the edges. Lady Beatrice remained near the doorway, her pearl necklace gleaming in the firelight like a string of small, pale warnings. Clara felt her father's silence beside her, not weakness this time, but restraint, the painful discipline of a man who had learned that rage gave his enemies too much satisfaction. "Your Grace," Preston said, recovering enough to bow, "you have a gift for making ordinary matters sound grave." Elias looked at him without blinking. "And you have a gift for standing in rooms where you are least wanted." A faint sound passed through Lady Beatrice's throat. Preston's smile hardened. "I came only to make certain Miss Whitmore understands that no offense was intended. Society can be clumsy when discussing practical truths." Clara lifted her eyes. "Practical truths are usually spoken with less enjoyment, my lord." For the first time that evening, Preston looked directly at her as though discovering she possessed a voice. "How spirited! Perhaps adversity has given you something after all." Earl Henry's hand moved against the blanket, but Clara placed her fingers over his before he could answer. She would not let Preston turn her father's pain into a spectacle again. Elias noticed the movement. His gaze lowered briefly to her hand, then returned to Preston with a stillness that made the air tighten. "Apologize to Miss Whitmore." Preston laughed once softly. "For what?" "For saying aloud what half the room has already thought. Her house is failing. Her father cannot advance her position. Her dowry is a polite fiction. Marriage among our class is not poetry, Your Grace. It is arithmetic." "Then you count poorly," Elias said. Lady Beatrice stepped forward at last, every inch the polished matron. "Duke of Westhaven, my son is young and perhaps unguarded in speech, but he is not wrong in substance. Miss Whitmore may be a lady by birth, but a name without fortune is only a memory wearing gloves." The insult was gentler than Preston's, and therefore colder. Clara felt it settle in the room like frost across glass. She had heard women like Lady Beatrice all her life, women who never raised their voices because the world had already raised them high enough to wound from above. "My mother wore those gloves," Clara said quietly. "She taught me that memory is sometimes the last honest inheritance a family has." Lady Beatrice's expression flickered. It was not guilt. Women like her did not give guilt the dignity of a public appearance. It was annoyance that the object of her pity had answered with grace. Elias turned slightly toward Clara, and in that small motion she felt something unexpected, not possession, not rescue, but recognition. Preston saw it too, and irritation sharpened him. "If your Grace wishes to champion tragic causes, that is your privilege. But do not pretend interest where there can only be charity. No duke in his right mind would bind Westhaven to Whitmore." The words seemed to echo beyond the walls, into the assembly hall, where the music had started again but faltered as guests drifted closer, drawn by the scent of scandal. The door remained open now. Faces gathered in the corridor, pale ovals above silk and lace, every person pretending not to listen while leaning toward the sound. Elias did not close the door. Instead, he stepped past Preston and into the threshold, forcing the private cruelty into public light. Clara followed because retreat would have made the room his and the shame hers. Earl Henry's chair moved with her, guided by Elias's gloved hand, as if the Duke had decided that dignity, once attacked before witnesses, must be restored before witnesses. The corridor widened into the East Gallery, where the chandeliers cast long gold reflections over the polished floor. Preston came after them, his pride now trapped by the audience he had wanted. "Let us not dramatize this," he said. "There is nothing dramatic," Elias replied, his voice carrying with effortless command. "There is only a question of measure. You measured Miss Whitmore by money, by convenience, by the weakness you imagined in her silence. I measured differently." The guests had gathered fully now. Lady Beatrice's fan trembled once, then stilled. Clara stood beside her father, every nerve alive, every breath careful. She did not know what Elias intended, and that uncertainty frightened her more than the insult had. The Duke faced the assembly, but when he spoke, his words belonged to her. "A woman who preserves a household while society abandons it has more strength than a man who inherits one and calls it virtue. A daughter who shields her father from mockery has more nobility than those who trade cruelty beneath chandeliers. And a lady who can stand in this room without begging for approval is not lacking value. She is revealing yours." Silence fell so completely that even the fire seemed distant. Preston's face flushed, then paled. Lady Beatrice looked as though every candle had turned toward her. Clara's throat tightened, not with tears, but with the terrible ache of being seen too clearly after years of being misnamed. Then Elias turned from the crowd, bowed before her a second time, and held out his hand. "Miss Clara Whitmore," he said, calm enough to shatter every whisper in Alderwick, "would you grant me the honor of speaking with your father about your future?" Clara did not take the Duke's hand at once. The entire gallery seemed to lean toward that suspended inch of air between them, as if every noble breath in Alderwick depended upon whether a woman they had dismissed would dare accept what the kingdom's most powerful man had offered. Her fingers remained at her side, curled lightly against the seam of her glove. She thought of Whitmore Grange at dawn, its white stone darkened by sea mist, its breakfast room warmed by a fire she had learned to tend herself when the servants became too few. She thought of her father awake before sunrise, pretending not to notice the bills folded beneath her sewing basket. She thought of all the invitations that had stopped arriving, all the doors that had closed with such gentle manners that no one could call them cruel. Then she looked at Elias Montgomery. He did not smile. He did not soften the moment with pretty words. His hand remained steady, not demanding, not rescuing her like a helpless thing from a flooded road, but offering her a place beside him as if she had already earned it. That was what made her reach forward. Her gloved fingers touched his palm, and a whisper moved through the gallery like wind through dry leaves. Elias bowed over her hand with formal restraint, the gesture perfectly proper, yet it struck the room harder than any declaration shouted in anger. Lord Preston Vale looked as though the floor had shifted beneath him. Lady Beatrice's mouth tightened until all her painted grace became a thin, colorless line. Earl Henry's eyes glistened, and for a moment Clara feared the sight of his pain would undo her. But he lifted his chin, and the old Earl returned, not in body, but in spirit, seated yet unbowed. Elias turned to him. "Lord Whitmore, I ask your permission to call upon your daughter at Whitmore Grange tomorrow morning." The request was flawless in its respect, but everyone heard what lived beneath it. This was no passing defense, no charitable performance to embarrass Preston and then vanish into rumor. The Duke of Westhaven had placed his name at the threshold of hers. Earl Henry's voice came slowly. "Your Grace, my daughter is not a convenience to be used against another man." A second silence fell, deeper than the first. Clara's heart tightened with love for him, for even diminished by illness and fortune, her father still guarded her, as though he could rise between her and the world. Elias inclined his head. "Nor would I insult her by treating her as one." "Then why?" Earl Henry asked. "Because courage should not be left undefended merely because it wears a mended sleeve." Clara felt the words enter her like warmth after a long season of cold. Preston gave a low laugh, desperate enough to be unwise. How noble! How theatrical! Shall we expect a wedding announcement by breakfast? Elias turned his gaze upon him. If Miss Whitmore consents, you may expect one before supper. The gallery went utterly still. Clara's breath caught, not from fear alone, but from the sudden vastness of the path opening before her. Marriage to Elias Montgomery would not be a rescue without cost. It would make her visible to every enemy who had preferred her forgotten. It would draw Whitmore into West Haven's shadow, and perhaps into the old danger her father had tried to name before his accident. She knew this. Elias knew she knew. That was why he looked at her then, not at the crowd, not at Preston, not at the watching mothers calculating alliances in their heads. Only at her. Miss Whitmore, he said, quieter now, though the room still heard him. I will not pretend this offer is simple. My house is not gentle. My name brings protection, but it also brings storms. I can promise respect. I can promise truth as far as I am able to give it. I cannot promise ease. It was the first honest proposal Clara had ever imagined. No poetry. No flattery. No false tenderness laid over a transaction. Just a door opening into darkness, with a man standing there who did not lie about the cold beyond it. Her father turned his head toward her. Clara, he whispered, and in that single word lived every sacrifice he feared she would make for him. She stepped closer and rested her hand on his shoulder, as she had done before the room tried to break them. Papa, all my life they have spoken of us as though we were already buried. Perhaps it is time we stopped living quietly enough to please them. Earl Henry closed his eyes. When he opened them, pride shone through the tears he refused to shed. Then you have my permission to receive his grace. Elias removed a signet ring from his right hand, the black stone bearing the crest of West Haven, a hawk above a storming sea. He did not force it onto Clara's finger. He placed it in her open palm, where the candlelight trembled across its dark surface. Until tomorrow, he said. Lady Beatrice whispered something to her son, but Preston did not answer. No one laughed now. As Clara closed her fingers around the ring, she understood that her life had not been saved from scandal. It had been carried directly into the center of it. And yet, for the first time in years, she was not afraid of being seen. By noon the next day, every parlor in North Alderwick had already rewritten Clara Whitmore's future according to its own appetite. Some called her fortunate, others ambitious, and a few, with smiles sharpened by envy, called her clever enough to turn pity into a title. None of them saw Whitmore Grange that morning, when the sea mist pressed against the windows and Clara stood in the front hall wearing the same pale blue gown, freshly brushed but still mended at the cuffs. She had not slept. The West Haven ring lay on a small silver tray beside her gloves, its black stone catching the grey light like a sealed storm. Earl Henry waited near the fireplace, dressed with painful care, his shoulders squared beneath an old formal coat that had been altered to fit the body life had left him. You may still refuse him, he said. Clara looked toward the drive, where the gravel curved between bare elm trees. I know. A duke's protection can become a duke's prison if the man offering it does not understand the woman accepting it. She turned to him, and the tenderness in her face softened everything the world had made hard. Then I will make certain he understands. The carriage arrived without ceremony, black lacquer dark against the pale road, drawn by 2 horses the color of smoke. Elias Montgomery stepped down alone. No escort, no cluster of servants, no display meant to impress a failing house. He removed his hat when Clara opened the door herself, and for one strange moment the hallway seemed too small to contain him, not because of his size, but because power followed him like weather. Miss Whitmore, he said. Lord Whitmore. Earl Henry studied him for a long second. Your Grace, my daughter does not need a master. Then we begin in agreement, Elias replied. Something almost like approval moved across the Earl's face. They spoke for nearly an hour in the old library, where faded maps of the coast hung beside shelves that smelled of dust, beeswax, and rain. Elias laid out no romantic illusion. Marriage to West Haven would restore Clara's standing, secure Whitmore Grange, and place her father beyond the reach of creditors. But it would also invite attention from men who preferred their secrets buried beneath polite society. He told her plainly that the valets would not forgive public disgrace. He told her that the missing letter might have named families still powerful enough to threaten reputations, fortunes, and lives without ever lifting a hand in public. Clara listened without flinching. "You speak as though you are offering a battlefield," she said. "I am offering a fortress," Elias answered. "But I will not lie and call it a garden." Her eyes moved toward the window, where the neglected rose beds lay silvered with frost. "A fortress can still grow one, if someone remembers where to plant." Elias looked at her then with the same grave attention he had given her in the gallery, as though every quiet word she spoke rearranged some old belief inside him. By evening the announcement was made. By the end of the week, the small chapel at Whitmore Grange was filled with white candles, winter greenery, and the strained silence of guests who had come less to bless than to witness. Clara walked beside her father's chair instead of being given away like property. At the altar, Elias waited in black, severe and still, his face unreadable to everyone but her. When he spoke his vows, his voice did not tremble. Neither did hers. There was no grand tenderness, no flushed promise of easy happiness. Only two wounded houses binding themselves before God, law, and a society that had misjudged them both. After the ceremony, Elias placed the Westhaven ring on her finger, and its dark stone felt cold for only a moment before warming against her skin. 3 days later, Clara crossed the northern road to Westhaven Keep. The castle rose from the cliffs above the sea, black stone against the white sky, its towers watching the water as if expecting the past to return by ship. Inside, the halls were immaculate but lifeless. Portraits watched from shadowed walls. Fires burned without comfort. Servants bowed with careful curiosity to the new Duchess who arrived with one trunk, one elderly maid, and no jewels except the ring the Duke had given her. Elias showed her the west rooms, the chapel, the library, and the glass conservatory where dead vines clung to iron frames like memories that had forgotten how to bloom. He did not show her the locked door at the end of the upper corridor. Clara noticed it because grief always had a temperature, and the air around that door was colder than the rest of the house. That night, in separate chambers divided by a sitting room neither of them entered, Clara lay awake listening to the sea strike the rocks 200 feet below. Near midnight, footsteps passed her door. They stopped at the end of the corridor. A long silence followed. Then Elias walked away. Clara did not rise. She did not follow. She only turned the ring on her finger once and understood that she had not married a monster, nor a savior, but a man standing guard over a grave no one else could see. In the weeks that followed, Westhaven Keep learned the sound of Clara's footsteps. She moved through its cold corridors without haste, speaking gently to servants who had expected grandeur, and found instead a duchess who remembered their names. She opened shutters in rooms that had not seen daylight in years. She ordered fresh linen for the east guest chambers, repaired the chapel curtains, and spent her mornings in the dead conservatory with a ledger in one hand and pruning shears in the other. The gardeners watched her at first with polite doubt, then with quiet loyalty, for she did not command flowers to bloom as if beauty were another servant to be summoned. She knelt in the damp soil, ruined her gloves, and learned where the old roots still lived. Elias noticed more than he admitted. From the library windows, he would see her beneath the iron arches, pale hair pinned loosely beneath a plain ribbon, her sleeves covered in dust, her face softened by concentration. She did not look like a woman who had married for a title. She looked like someone who had entered a dying house and decided death had been given too much authority. Yet between them, courtesy remained a wall. They dined together each evening at opposite ends of a table long enough to host 20 guests, though only 2 plates were set. Elias asked about her father. Clara asked about the estate tenants. He answered fully, never coldly, but always with the discipline of a man who measured every personal word before releasing it. Sometimes she caught him studying her when he thought the candlelight hid his expression. Sometimes he caught her looking toward the upper corridor, where the locked room waited. Either spoke of it. Then, on a rain-dark afternoon, Clara entered the West Library searching for old planting records and found a narrow drawer beneath the map cabinet that did not quite close. The brass handle resisted, swollen from years of damp sea air, but at last it opened with a soft scrape. Inside lay bundles of correspondence tied in faded blue thread, estate surveys, shipping accounts, and a small packet sealed with cracked wax bearing the Whitmore crest. Clara's breath left her slowly. For a moment she only stared. The room seemed to retreat around her, the shelves rising like silent witnesses, the rain tapping against the tall windows in careful warning. She lifted the packet with trembling hands. The wax had been broken and pressed closed again, clumsily, as if someone had opened it in haste and regretted leaving evidence. Within was not the original letter, but a copied summary in her father's hand, written before the accident. Duke of Westhaven, if this reaches you, then I have reason to fear that the crown is being quietly bound by debts arranged through false ledgers and noble signatures. The names I have confirmed include Vale, Harrowmont, and at least 2 members of the Treasury Council. The final proof travels separately. Trust no messenger recommended by Lord Preston Vale. Clara read the words twice, then a third time, until they burned clearer than the fire in the grate. Her father had known. Her father had tried to warn Elias. And the Vallas had not merely mocked her family after its fall. They had helped push the first stone. A sound at the door made her turn. Elias stood there, rain darkening the shoulders of his coat, his face still until his eyes found the packet in her hand. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Clara crossed the room and held it out to him. My father was telling the truth. Elias did not take the papers immediately. He looked at her hand, at the Whitmore crest, then at her face. Something moved through his expression, not surprise, not pity, but the deep recognition of a man who had spent years searching a locked room only to find the key in the palm of someone he had underestimated. Where did you find this? He asked. Here. Hidden among your maps. He accepted the packet with great care, as though careless fingers might wound the dead as well as the living. His gaze lowered to the handwriting, and Clara saw the old grief return, the grief tied not only to her father's warning but to the woman he had lost before Clara ever crossed his path. My betrothed. Carried the final proof, he said quietly. Her name was Margaret Ellery. She believed the truth could save the kingdom if it reached me before Parliament convened. Clara's voice softened. And it never did. No. The word was small, but the room seemed to darken around it. Elias turned toward the rain-streaked window, his jaw set against memory. For years I thought I had failed her because I arrived too late. Then I thought your father's silence meant he had abandoned the matter. Now I see both of them were surrounded before they understood the shape of the trap. Clara stepped nearer, not enough to intrude, only enough that he would not stand entirely alone with the past. Then we do not let their courage remain buried. Elias looked at her. The distance between them changed, not in inches, but in meaning. She was no longer the woman he had defended before cruel guests, nor merely the wife his name protected. She was witness, ally, and flame. Preston will strike first, he said. He already has, Clara answered, closing her fingers around the edge of the desk. He simply mistook humiliation for victory. The Royal Winter Ball was held 3 weeks later in the capital, beneath a ceiling painted with angels who looked down upon politics disguised as celebration. Snow fell beyond the palace windows in soft, obedient sheets, whitening the carriage roofs and the marble steps while inside, every candle burned as if commanded by the crown itself. Clara entered on Elias Montgomery's arm wearing ivory silk without diamonds, without feathers, without the glittering armor society expected from a duchess eager to prove herself. Her only ornament was the black Westhaven ring, dark against her glove, and a small silver locket containing a curl of her mother's hair. The court noticed. The court always noticed simplicity when it could not punish extravagance. Whispers followed her across the ballroom, but they broke differently now, not over pity, but over uncertainty. She was no longer the quiet daughter standing beside a wheelchair in Alderwick. She was Duchess of Westhaven, and the man beside her had the power to make silence expensive. Elias felt the tension gathering. Before Clara did. He recognized the placement of men near the south columns, the false brightness of Lady Beatrice Vale's smile, the way Lord Preston lingered near the King's private secretary with a folded document in hand. "They are ready," he said softly. Clara looked ahead, her expression serene. "So are we." Across the room, Earl Henry Whitmore waited in his chair beside the entrance to the royal dais, dressed in midnight blue, his silver hair brushed back, his old signet restored to his hand. Clara had insisted he come not as an invalid to be hidden near the wall, but as a witness. When his eyes met hers, he gave the smallest nod, and the years between them, all the bills, cold rooms, sold heirlooms, and swallowed insults, seemed to stand with him. The orchestra began a waltz, but before the first couples could form, Preston stepped forward and bowed to the king with practiced sorrow. "Your Majesty, forgive an unpleasant duty. I hold evidence that the Earl of Whitmore, long sheltered by sympathy, once concealed treasonous correspondence and endangered the financial stability of the realm." A gasp traveled through the ballroom. Lady Beatrice lowered her eyes as if grief had overcome her, though triumph shone through the spaces between her lashes. Clara felt Elias's arm tense beneath her fingers. He was ready to speak, to strike with the full force of Westhaven's name, but she placed her hand lightly over his wrist. "Not yet." The king, older than Clara expected and far more tired, looked toward Earl Henry. "Lord Whitmore, what answer do you give?" Her father opened his mouth, but Clara stepped forward first. The room shifted in surprise. Women did not interrupt charges of treason. Young duchesses did not cross marble floors alone while the oldest families in the kingdom watched like judges. Clara did both. She stopped at the center of the ballroom, where the candlelight caught the plain ivory of her gown and made it almost luminous. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice calm enough to shame the trembling whispers around her. "My father did conceal correspondence, but not against the crown. He preserved a warning meant to protect it." Preston laughed softly. "A convenient daughter's devotion." Clara turned to him. "No, Lord Vale. A dead man's handwriting. A missing ledger. And your own family seal on 3 false debt transfers." The laughter vanished. Elias moved then, but only to stand behind her, not in front of her. His presence was a wall, yet he allowed her voice to be the door. Clara opened the packet found in Westhaven's library, then withdrew copies of the accounts Elias's agents had recovered from a merchant house near the harbor. She did not speak quickly. She did not accuse with wild emotion. She read names, dates, amounts, and signatures, each one falling into the ballroom with the clean weight of a church bell. Vale. Harrowmont. 2 treasury councillors. A banking office that no longer existed except in records men had forgotten to burn. Preston's face hardened, then emptied. Lady Beatrice's fan slipped from her hand and struck the floor. The king leaned forward, his expression no longer weary. "Duke of Westhaven," he said, "do you verify these documents?" Elias bowed. "I do, Your Majesty. My late betrothed died carrying the final proof. Lord Whitmore attempted to send the first warning. Both were silenced by reputation before truth could arrive." No one moved. Even the orchestra seemed afraid to breathe through its strings. Clara looked toward her father, and for the first time since his accident, she saw the burden lift from his face. Not entirely. Some sorrows do not leave when justice enters. But shame, that old thief, loosened its hand. Preston tried once more, desperation making him careless. "This is manipulation. She has used grief, marriage, and rank to hide a failing bloodline behind Westhaven's power." Clara faced him without flinching. "No, my lord. I used the one thing you never feared from me." Her voice softened, and because it softened, everyone listened harder. "The truth." The king rose. Guards approached the accused men, not with spectacle, but with the quiet finality of a door closing. Lady Beatrice looked at Clara as if seeing her for the first time, and perhaps that was the cruelest punishment of all, to realize too late that the woman she had dismissed had been holding the key to her ruin. Elias stepped beside Clara, his hand near hers but not touching until she chose to meet it. When her fingers rested against his palm, the ballroom bowed, not to scandal, not to pity, and not merely to rank, but to the dignity of a woman who had walked into the center of judgment and left her enemies speechless. The judgment of the royal winter ball did not end with raised voices, but with lowered eyes. That was how society confessed when it could not apologize. Within a month, the Vale estates were placed under royal inquiry, the false debts were dissolved, and the names that had fed upon silence were spoken in daylight until they lost their power to frighten. Earl Henry Whitmore was summoned to the palace not as a relic of pity, but as a man wronged in service to the crown. The king received him before the court, and though the apology was formal, its weight carried farther than any whispered insult in Alderwick ever had. Clara stood beside her father as the royal seal restored the honor of Whitmore Grange, and when the old earl bowed his head, it was not from shame, but from the exhaustion of a man finally permitted to lay down a burden he had carried too long. Yet justice, Clara learned, did not mend every crack at once. The world could restore a name faster than a heart could trust it. When she returned to Westhaven Keep, the sea still struck the cliffs 200 feet below, the corridors still held their winter silence, and the locked door at the end of the upper hall still waited. But something had changed. The servants moved with less fear. Fires were lit in rooms that had been cold for years. In the conservatory, green shoots pushed through dark soil where Clara had cut away the dead vines, small and brave beneath panes of rain-washed glass. She spent her mornings there, sometimes with letters, sometimes with seedlings, sometimes with no purpose beyond listening to the wind move over the iron roof. Elias often found her there, though at first he pretended coincidence brought him. He would stand near the lemon trees she had ordered from the southern coast, one gloved hand resting on the back of a chair, speaking of tenant repairs, harbor accounts, or her father's improved strength. Clara let him hide behind practical matters until hiding no longer served either of them. One evening, as snow began to fall over the sea, Elias came to the conservatory carrying a key. He did not hold it out like an offering. He held it like a wound. Clara looked from the key to his face. "You do not have to open it for me," she said. "No," he answered. "I have to open it for myself." Together they walked to the upper corridor. The house seemed to listen. When Elias unlocked the door, the room beyond revealed no horror, only grief preserved too carefully, a writing desk, a covered portrait, a music box, dried flowers in a porcelain bowl, and curtains drawn against years of sunrise. This had been the room where Margaret Ellery's belongings were kept after her death, untouched because touching them had once felt like betrayal. Elias stood at the threshold for a long time. Clara did not urge him forward. Love, she had learned, was not always the hand that pulled. Sometimes it was the presence that stayed. At last he crossed the room and uncovered the portrait. Margaret's painted face looked back with calm intelligence, forever young in the strange mercy of art. Elias breathed in once, unsteadily. "I thought if I let this room change, I would lose the last proof that she mattered." Clara stood beside him, close enough for warmth, far enough for reverence. "People do not matter less because we begin living again." His eyes closed briefly. When they opened, the years in them had not vanished, but they no longer ruled him. The next morning, the room was aired. Not emptied, not erased, but returned to the house with honor. Some of Margaret's books were placed in the library. Her music box went to the conservatory, where its gentle song played among new leaves. The dried flowers were buried beneath a young white rose Clara planted herself. Spring came slowly to Westhaven, as if the earth doubted its welcome. Then one morning the conservatory bloomed in pale gold, soft pink, and green so vivid it seemed almost defiant. Earl Henry came to stay for a fortnight, his chair set beside the warmest window, his laughter quiet but real as he watched Clara direct gardeners with the calm authority of a duchess who had never mistaken gentleness for weakness. That evening, Elias found her beneath the glass roof, the last light resting on her hair and the Westhaven ring dark upon her hand. "I asked for your hand because I needed the truth your family carried," he said. "I know," Clara replied. He stepped closer, his voice lower, not dramatic, but honest. I kept it because I found courage I did not know how to live without. Clara looked at him then, not as a savior, not as a duke, but as the lonely man beneath both names. She placed her hand over his, and outside, the sea continued its ancient work against the cliffs, patient, relentless, changed by nothing and yet somehow softer in the evening light. Westhaven Keep did not become a cheerful house all at once. Such things belonged to fairy tales, and theirs had been built from harder stone. But candles burned longer. Doors remained open. The chapel bells rang on clear mornings. And when society spoke Clara's name at last, it did not know whether to call her fortunate, formidable, or beloved. She was all three, and more than any of them. Some hearts are not rescued by grand declarations, but by the quiet courage of someone who refuses to look away.